Charles. There are sounds one forgets with time. The wind through the trees, the clinking of an old glass. Even the creak of a door can become part of the silence as the years pass. But there's one that stays there, trapped in some corner of memory, no matter how many years go by, no matter how many times you try to sleep. That sound comes back, like a whisper made of flesh, as if something were breaking from the inside.
The sound of the whip when it strikes human skin. Yes, I remember it too. There is no scream that can cover it, no prayer that can calm it. It's dry, it's harsh, and at the same time, sacred for some. They didn't strike out of rage, Daniel. They struck out of faith. They tore their backs open as if each wound brought them closer to forgiveness.
You and I saw them, not once, not in just one place. It was as if madness had taken human form and decided to walk across Europe, white covered, but filled with red. They didn't beg for alms. They didn't ask for food. They asked for punishment, and the worst part was, the people applauded.
How did it all begin? I've tried to forget, but there are nights when I dream of robes soaked in blood, prayers mumbled through broken teeth, and children watching from corners, not knowing whether they were seeing a miracle or a curse. And the most macabre thing of all is that they believed they were saving the world.
And maybe that's what was most terrifying. Not that they hurt themselves, but that they did it convinced that it was the right thing. That pain was a form of redemption, a sort of key to crawl into heaven.
Sometimes I wonder, what kind of God listens better to those who bleed? And how broken must the world be for suffering to become religion?
You know it well. What we saw wasn't devotion. It was an epidemic, a prayer made flesh, a procession of living specters who weren't seeking mercy, only atonement.
And so they came, marching through cities, villages, roads, singing with shattered voices, bleeding out as if the apocalypse had dictated their pace. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't ask permission. They just arrived and began to whip themselves.
And when the last lash fell, what remained wasn't salvation. It was fear. It was something that wouldn't leave, an echo, a whisper, a memory that creeps in on nights like this. And though it seemed they were born from dust, it wasn't so. There was an origin, a name, a city, Perugia, year of our Lord, 1260. Italy already smelled of incense, but also of fear. And there, among crooked crosses and trembling church bells, he appeared. Raniero Fasani, a broken man, a penitent, or a fanatic.
They say Raniero heard voices that didn't ask for prayers. They asked for blood. Blood as proof of faith, and not someone else's, his own. By day he preached, by night he beat himself until he collapsed to the ground. He said the world was rotten, that God would not listen unless pain spoke louder than sin.
And it didn't take long for the people to catch on. First it was 5, then 20, then hundreds, all dressed in white, with hoods that hid faces already deformed by remorse. They called themselves the Flagellants. They marched through cities, staggering, praying with a voice that sounded more like a groan from the grave. They didn't eat, they didn't sleep, they only walked and punished themselves.
I remember the first time I saw them. It was as if the plague had taken human form. Their backs torn open, their chants monotonous, sticky, as if they were trying to summon something that should not answer. Some collapsed unconscious, others died screaming, but the group kept going.
They didn't want to die, Charles. They wanted to deserve death. They wanted to look to the sky with their bones exposed and for God to descend, even if only to curse them.
And the worst part is that people applauded them. They believed they brought purification, that their pain would cleanse the air, the rivers, the fields. Mothers brought their children to see the saints with broken flesh. The priests blessed them.
Do you remember Verona? There. One of them tore the skin from his chest with a hook. He said his heart was black, and that if he ripped it out, a purer one might be born.
And no one stopped him. They surrounded him. They prayed. They sang while he bled. The whole city smelled of hot iron, and everyone saw it as an act of love, as if God was sitting in the front row.
Raniero created something stronger than fear. He created collective guilt, a guilt that spread like a plague, and like every plague, it mutated. But Raniero didn't die alone. He died, transformed into a seed, because after him, the whips bloomed like weeds, and Europe began to bleed. First it was Umbria, then Tuscany, then Rome, and from there, the evil became a trail, a path of penance that crossed the Alps and reached France, Germany, Poland, Flanders, even England, a river of white robes that purified nothing. It only left blood.
And they weren't few, Daniel. In 1349, in Magdeburg alone, more than 8,000 Flagellants marched together, a procession that lasted 33 days without stopping. They slept in cemeteries, prayed with ropes tied around their necks, sang hymns that sounded more like reversed exorcisms. They said the plague was a punishment, and that only extreme suffering could redeem the world. But in truth, they were the ones bringing the punishment.
Wherever they arrived, fear preceded them. Basel, Strasbourg, Vienna, Brussels, Paris, entire cities welcomed them as prophets, and then fell like sick flocks. In Erfurt, after the Flagellants left, the plague killed 60% of the population. And even so, people kept imitating them. Children whipped themselves with branches. The elderly touched them like living relics. And women placed their wounds in water to bless their babies.
Every city they touched bled afterward, as if their steps left behind a contaminated spiritual echo. In Cologne, there were mass suicides because of the visions they left behind. They said the prayers of the Flagellants clung to the air like invisible poison.
And the most monstrous thing was what they did in the name of God, because they began to believe that if the punishment was for the sins of the world, then the sinners had to be eliminated, and the purges began. First prostitutes, then Jews, then lepers, beggars, and anyone who didn't look them in the eye. In Mainz, the Flagellants massacred 6,000 people in 3 days. In Speyer, they threw entire families into wells, believing they were contaminating the water with their impurity.
And they did it, with chants, with crucifixes in hand, with tears on their faces. They said it was love, but it sounded like hate. They said it was faith, but it smelled of burned flesh and rusted nails.
And the more they walked, the more they deformed. Some tore out their own nails. Others cut their backs open with cross-shaped blades. And the most fanatical drove nails into their tongues to avoid speaking for 40 days, only praying, only moaning.
And no one stopped them. The bishops blessed them, the kings ignored them, and the people followed them as if they were the heralds of the end of the world.
Because that's what they were, Charles. The end of the world, walking.
There's always one who refuses to just follow, one who chooses to lead, even if it's straight into the abyss. In Germany, Conrad Schmidt emerged, a man who didn't just flog himself, but spoke on behalf of pain. He claimed that words no longer mattered, that prayers were weak, that the sacraments were dead, that the church was a rotting corpse, and that the only voice God could hear was the voice of the whip.
They called him the Herald of Blood. Others, simply, the madman of Thuringia. But he didn't ask for obedience. He demanded absolute submission to suffering. Conrad banned the Eucharist, banned confession. He said that faith wasn't found in forgiveness, but in punishment. And the worst part is that people followed him. Thousands followed him. Thousands of barefoot men in robes soaked with their own blood, crossing towns like fallen angels.
And what began as penance turned into war. They stormed churches and destroyed the altars. They claimed the cross was no longer sacred, that the only symbol of redemption was an open, bleeding back. In Würzburg, they looted 3 monasteries in a single night, burned Bibles, trampled on the host, and carved into the church doors with knives. God is not here, only pain speaks.
They no longer sought forgiveness, Charles. They craved punishment. And it didn't matter who paid the price. In Freiburg, they executed 7 sick children. They claimed their deformities were divine punishment. In Metz, they dragged adulterous women through the streets, naked, tied with cords of thorns, not for justice, for spectacle. And the worst part, people watched, prayed, applauded.
Conrad became more than a leader. He was a symbol of religious apocalypse. They were called the purifiers of the end. And in some villages they were treated like saints. They collected blood from their backs in jars and sold it as miraculous relics. But what they left behind weren't miracles. It was ash.
And then it happened. The inevitable moment. They attacked a bishop in Bamberg. They dragged him from the pulpit mid-sermon and flogged him until his robe matched theirs in color, red. That's when the church awoke, and for the first time, it didn't bless them. It excommunicated them, hunted them down.
But the damage was done. Faith had been disfigured. The streets knew the sound of the whip better than the sound of the bells. And even though the Flagellants were hunted as heretics, their idea had already seeped into the European soul.
A simple idea, a dark idea. God doesn't respond to prayers, he responds to wounds. I saw it. First came silence, then the funeral bells that never stopped ringing, and then them, the men in white, the sons of punishment, those who prayed, screaming.
Year 1348. Europe was bleeding, but not from the whip, from the plague, the Black Death, the Great Cleanser, the disease that erased entire cities in less than a month, that turned necks black, faces purple, and faith rotten. And right there, in the middle of the apocalypse, they marched, thousands, in line, in a trance.
white robes stained in blood, covered heads, empty eyes. They claimed their penance would save the world, that the end would not come if the pain was enough, that if they beat themselves until their souls screamed, God would hear them, but the heavens remained silent.
The villagers welcomed them with hope. They opened their doors, offered them food, water, ears to listen to their macabre chants. But by the third day, the smell changed. The plague arrived, and they died. They all died.
People thought they were prophets. They were carriers, not of faith, but of disease. Wherever they went, the plague multiplied, their robes soaked in blood, their bodies filthy, their hands touching everyone in the name of redemption. But what they left behind wasn't redemption. It was rot. It was death. It was plague.
People began to fear them, to shut their doors, to hide their children. Because they weren't the remedy. They were another plague.
In Strasbourg, they were stoned. In Magdeburg, they were burned. And in Metz, their tongues were cut off so they could preach no more. But the movement had already mutated. It was no longer religion. It was a spiritual epidemic, an infection of the soul, a hysteria that prayed while it died.
And the plague didn't stop, because God didn't ask for blood, only humanity, and they had forgotten it.
Time passed. The cities returned to silence. But silence is never total. There are nights. Nights without moon, without prayers, without wind, when the air hurts, and some elders, those who still keep memory, swear they hear the echo of leather striking flesh. No graves, no names. There were no funerals.
Only dried blood remained stuck to the stone walls, like a cursed signature, like a gospel no one dares to read, the gospel of pain, the one written without ink, the one written with wounds.
And so the story of the Flagellants was sealed, not with redemption, not with forgiveness, but with intentional forgetting, because to remember is to risk believing again.
And if there's anything worse than blind faith, it's faith thirsty for blood. That doesn't seek to save you, but to make you suffer for not having been saved.
Faith saved many, but it also flayed them alive. And when prayer becomes punishment and sin is torn out with whips, what remains is not holiness.
It's an altar filled with broken flesh. It wasn't the darkness that consumed them. It was the twisted light, the kind that no longer guides, but blinds. Prayer doesn't always save. Sometimes it drags you deeper than sin ever could.
There were those who never sinned, and still they were hung from the soul and left to bleed for the salvation of others. Because when faith loses love, all that's left is fire, and that fire does not purify. That fire screams. There are scars that never close because they're still praying inside. And if you listen closely, deep within the silence, you can hear them